My thesis for this video, which I believe is a natural conclusion of a lot of what I've read, but I haven't heard it articulated in this formulation. So that's why I'm calling it like a thesis. I could be kind of wrong about this, but this is the way that I kind of understand it. Unwanted. So everyone experiences unwanted intrusive thoughts. And we'll define what that means. But generally, most people, from what I've read, like 90% of people in surveys that they've done, have experienced before what we called an unwanted intrusive thought. Okay. Just bear with me if you don't understand the terms I'm using, just understand the thesis itself, right? Most people experience unwanted intrusive thoughts. However, for some people with an OCD sensitive mind, and we'll discuss what that means, but for some people that have that kind of mind, their unwanted intrusive thoughts get stuck. And what I mean by get stuck is that it is there's a very high frequency of these thoughts and there's a very high intensity of these thoughts. And that combination of a high frequency and intensity makes the subjective experience of these thoughts very, very distressing, which triggers the person to kind of try to do certain things to alleviate that anxiety. And that kind of is what creates this cycle of obsessive compulsive disorder. And, if it gets bad enough to a certain point, it'll cross the threshold of, it's officially obsessive compulsive disorder because it's really these obsessive and compulsive cycles are really taking over your life, essentially. Now, a good metaphor to understand what I'm trying to say is that imagine unwanted intrusive thoughts are like a tiny match flame, right? You light a match, and let's say you drop it in the mind of someone who doesn't really have this OCD sensitivity, right? For that person's mind, it'll like burn for a second, kind of like, whoa, that was a weird thought. And then they'll kind of like move past it, right? For a person with an OCD sensitive mind, that tiny match flame is dropped. And imagine this OCD sensitive mind is incredibly flammable. And when that match flame drops into this type of mind, it ignites the inferno, the one that we know as obsessive compulsive disorder. And today, that is what we are going to be exploring. What exactly are the mechanisms that create this inferno, and why is it created for some people and not for others? Okay, so like we said, let's answer the question, how do unwanted intrusive thoughts, like we said, unwanted intrusive thoughts are the initial starting place that kind of leads to this obsessive compulsive cycle. How do these differ from more general anxiety type of thoughts, right? Let's explore that. So they differ in 4 ways. The first way is that anxious thoughts are ego-syntonic. This is a word in the OCD literature, ego-syntonic, right? Unwanted intrusive thoughts are ego-dystonic. A good way to think about this, ego-syntonic, ego sync, in sync with ego. Ego-dystonic, out of sync with ego. It's a very simple way to put it. But basically, what ego-syntonic thoughts are, they have a few features. They are in alignment with your will. So when the thought arrives, it doesn't feel like a thought is being imposed upon you. It feels like very much a natural part of the natural flow of your thinking. The content itself of the thought is consistent with your self-image, your values, the ideals you have, your morals, certain truths that you hold, the things that you would typically be worried about and care about. This thought feels subjectively like consistent with those things. And this is why, by the way, the pen example from the last video where I was like making fun of the idea that like, people say like, oh, like I need, or maybe I need this book to be in this place and not that place. I need things perfectly neat. That's my OCD acting up. It's like, that's not your OCD acting up. And here's why. Because many people, when they say that, what they're referring to is that I have this desire for things to be looking in a really like perfect way. And that desire aligns with my sense of self. Like it's something I actually want to see. There's a sense of satisfaction that I'm seeking. So it's a desire that's aligned with my sense of self. And I'm trying to like move the book just to get that perfect sensation of like, okay, the book is in the right place, you know? And so subjectively, the experience is not very distressing for you. It's not one in which there are constantly cycles that you're going through where you're trying to get it in the right place, and every time you move it, it's still not good enough, and you can't stop yourself, and you keep moving it over and over again to pursue this idea of just right, and you feel this sense of like something bad is really going to happen unless I get it just right. If that's what's happening to you, then that's possibly more in line with an ego-dystonic thought. But most of the time, most manifestations of this are just chasing this type of satisfaction. And that's born out of this kind of personality trait that you identify with, which is that you like to see things placed in the right way. Now, one thing to clarify with ego-syntonic thoughts is that they can still feel uncomfortable. They can still feel distressing. We're not saying that these thoughts necessarily are thoughts that always feel good for the person. So, for example, the content of an ego-syntonic thought can still be full of a fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, of loss, a general type of anxiety, rumination about the uncertainty of life, struggling to find a sense of belonging, identity, and purpose, sadness about personal tragedies or suffering in the world. All of these kinds of struggles, what makes them ego-syntonic is that they feel subjectively authentic to your story, your mental story. Even if from an outside viewpoint, this is very important, from an outside viewpoint, someone else may view these things as exaggerated. Your concerns are exaggerated, they're misplaced, they're inaccurate, they're even morally questionable. Like, let's say you're kind of like being a little bit narcissistic in a scenario, a little bit selfish, but it's coming from you. Like, this is me. This is my, and this is an authentic expression of my sense of self and value and identities in this moment. Then that's not an ego-dystonic thought. That's very much an ego-syntonic thought. There's also an attitude of identification. Ego-syntonic thoughts, you kind of subjectively feel like this thought is me. You kind of own the thought. Like, I recognize this thought. I feel at home with this thought. And this last point is that you are genuinely engaged with the substance and conclusions of the thought. So let's say like you have a thought about, what if I get laid off because I did something bad at work and my manager's kind of pissed off. It seems like you are actually invested in the substance of the thought itself. You actually are engaged with it meaningfully, and you actually want to arrive at a conclusion for the thought. Like, am I going to get laid off? Am I not going to get laid off? It looks kind of like a normal, logical thought process of investigation. And this may not make full sense in terms of like what could be the alternative to this, but just sit with that for a second. Okay? So those are ego-syntonic thoughts. Even if it's painful to you, it matters to you because it connects to your values, your desire, or your identity. You want to work with the thought. What is this thought telling me? How should I respond in reality? Now, an ego-dystonic thought, it has a few key features. An ego-dystonic thought, which again are more unwanted intrusive thoughts, they arrive as imposed rather than willed. So like we said with an ego-syntonic thought, a general anxious concern, it arrives kind of as like a natural flow of my thinking. Versus an ego-dystonic thought arrives as imposed. It kind of feels like an alien invasion, like an intrusion, like, whoa, what was that? This came out of nowhere. That's hence the intrusive part of unwanted intrusive thoughts, right? The content seems inconsistent with your self-image and values. They clash with what you would typically care about in terms of how you see yourself, your ideals, your morality, your identity. And here it's important that we give some examples so you really understand what we mean. Let's say you love children. Okay, you're a caretaker, you're a parent. You may then get a thought about violating a child sexually, physically. Very distressing experience for you because that doesn't align with who I am. I would never do such a thing. Like, why would I get such a thought like that? Let's say, for example, you're in a happy and secure, fulfilling relationship. You may get a thought that your spouse is secretly repulsed by you or in love with someone else. Let's say you're a person of faith. You may get a thought about doubting God's existence, when in reality, you are not doubting God's existence. You feel very affirmed that God does exist, but you get this thought: what if you're wrong? What if God doesn't exist? And it seems inconsistent with what you would actually want to be thinking about right now, or what actually aligns with your natural kind of doubts of your mind. You may get a thought about your worship being unacceptable, a thought that what if God is punishing me or he's not accepting the worship that I'm doing, even though subjectively there is no really reason for why your sense of identity and sense of self would gravitate toward these types of thoughts. So they feel almost like foreign coming to you from an outside place that's threatening your already established sense of self and identity and morality and truth. There's an attitude of disidentification with the thought. When it arrives, you experience this thought as like, this is not me and this is not welcome. And lastly, there is your whereas before with an ego-syntonic thought, you actually want to engage with the thought's presence. With an ego-dystonic thought, you are threatened by the thought's presence, by the mere presence of the thought, which means that you're not actually interested in substantive engagement with the thought. Rather, the fact that the thought is even there, you are threatened by its mere existence because it feels contradictory to who you are. So the distress comes from the mere suggestion that, oh, did you disbelieve in God? Oh, could you have possibly hurt your would you possibly hurt your child? The You're not actually substantively engaging these thoughts. Like, I don't know, would I actually kind of hurt my child? No, you don't even like open the thought up. Like imagine the thought is like you could open it, but you don't even open it. You just look at it and you're just threatened by its mere existence. Like, no, that's not true. And it yields itself to this kind of like black and white dichotomy where again you're not actually thinking about actual conclusions of the thought, which are like nuanced typically, like, yeah, this could possibly be the case, but there are also some other factors to consider, like a nuanced answer. It's more of like a black and white yes or no conclusion. And you're trying to fight for no, but the thought is telling you, well, maybe it's a yes. And there's like this battle, but the battle is not over like a meaningful, nuanced conclusion, but it's over like a yes or no answer that you're like fighting for. That's kind of like the experience of the unwanted intrusive thought. So to wrap it up, right? An anxious thought, an ego-syntonic thought typically will arrive. And we're using the words typically because, again, a lot of this is subjective. It's describing the nature of thoughts, which is a subjective kind of thing. But an ego-syntonic thought will be this thought expresses me. It belongs to my self story, even if it's uncomfortable and difficult and distressing. That's ego-syntonic thoughts, generally anxious thoughts. Versus an unwanted intrusive thought, unwanted intrusive, is that it feels like an attack on me, a threat on me. It doesn't belong to my self story, and I wish that this thought would go away. And by the way, this helps us appreciate why ego-dystonic thoughts are so distressing. A good way to put it is that they threaten the sacred territory of your mind. Imagine you like put a line in the sand in a certain area of your mind, and you say, look, my thoughts can threaten any part of my mind, but this area, these values, these truths that I deeply care about, I don't want anyone threatening this. And imagine these are the types of thoughts that threaten that area. And that's why it feels so subjectively distressing for the person, especially because they're not actually wanting to think about these things, but these thoughts arrive and are threatening the very things that you care most about. It feels like an affront on your very identity and your sense of self. Just for the sake of giving more examples, some other types of examples of kind of like unwanted intrusive thoughts could be there's harm and violence type of unwanted intrusive thoughts. Okay. So, for example, and I'm just going to read off examples here. I have a bunch of examples. So, what if I suddenly stab someone I love while holding a knife? What if I swerve my car into oncoming traffic? What if I drop my baby off the balcony? Okay. Harm and violence. There's sexual or taboo types of thoughts. What if I'm sexually attracted to a child or a family member? What if I touch someone inappropriately without realizing? What if I what if a sexual image pops up during my prayer? Okay, there's death and catastrophe types of thoughts. What if my mom dies in a car crash today? What if I hit a pedestrian without noticing? What if I forgot to turn off the stove and the house burns down? There's relationship types of unwanted intrusive thoughts. What if I don't really love my partner? What if my partner secretly doesn't love me? What if I'm staying in this relationship out of guilt and not love? What if this partner really isn't the one? Religious or morality, scrupulosity types of thoughts. What if I've committed an unforgivable sin? What if in my prayer it wasn't accepted because I said something wrong or I said it the wrong way? What if I'm not connecting with God perfectly enough? I'm not thinking the right way. My connection is not good enough. What if I'm having bad thoughts during worship, and that means that I no longer believe, or my worship is invalidated and my whole belief is invalidated? Okay, contamination and disease type of unwanted intrusive thoughts. So, what if I touch something with HIV on it? What if I bring germs home and infect my family? What if the soap I used was contaminated? Existential and reality types of unwanted intrusive thoughts. What if none of this is real and I'm imagining everything? What if I forgot how to breathe because I'm thinking about it? What if I forget how to read? What if I'm losing my mind right now? Sexual orientation and identity types of thoughts. What if I'm secretly gay and lying to myself? What if I'm not actually straight and deceiving my partner? What if I'll never be sure who I'm attracted to? Moral responsibility types of thoughts. What if I ran over someone and didn't notice? What if I made someone suicidal without realizing it? What if I left the door unlocked and a burglar gets in? There's a memory or false confession types of unwanted intrusive thoughts. What if I did something terrible and I don't remember? What if a dream I had was actually real? What if my memory can no longer be trusted? There's self and identity types of unwanted intrusive thoughts. What if my emotions are fake? What if I'm secretly a bad person and don't know it? What if I'm pretending to care about people when I don't actually care? Then there's symmetry or just right types of unwanted intrusive thoughts. What if the picture frame isn't perfectly straight and something bad happens? What if I didn't lock the door with equal pressure and it causes some kind of harm? What if I don't step evenly on both feet and something goes wrong? And finally, miscellaneous or odd types of thoughts, um, typically around a sudden loss of control. So, what if I shout something obscene at a funeral? What if I jump from this balcony even though I don't want to? What if thinking this thought makes it happen, like makes the jumping happen? Okay, that was a lot. And I know some of these thoughts sound like really particular, really weird, really uh just random. And that's the whole point. That's the nature of these types of thoughts. And again, I want to reiterate these arrive as ego-dystonic sensations. So they conflict with your sense of self. These it's different if you're like philosophically thinking about the nature of reality and you happen to land on one of these thoughts, right? But then again, maybe it transitions from ego-syntonic to an ego-dystonic experience, you know? And it starts to manifest itself as an unwanted intrusive thought, even though it initially started as something you were entertaining, but eventually you were like, no, 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 I don't want to be thinking about this anymore. And then it like continues to arrive again and again. Right. And that's not the only feature. That's one of them. So we're going to continue to discuss more. But I just wanted to give that nuance there because, again, we're talking about something subjective. So it's possible that someone is like, well, I can think of this counterexample. And it's like, okay, cool. But let's take all of these factors together because we said there's 4 reasons. And as we start to build the case, it will be more clear. And especially in future videos, as we start to show kind of how these thoughts manifest itself in terms of how they make you feel and all of that kind of stuff, it will start to become more clear. Okay, so that was the first reason. The first thing is that ego-syntonic versus ego-dystonic types of thoughts, right? And now we really understand what some examples of unwanted intrusive thoughts are. The second way that unwanted intrusive thoughts differ from general anxious thoughts is that general and anxious thoughts seem to be connected with reality, while unwanted intrusive thoughts seem to be disconnected from reality. What do I mean by that? With an unwanted intrusive thought, you almost get this feeling that reality and the thought are like two separate entities. Reality is kind of doing its own thing, and then the thought in your mind is kind of doing its own thing. Let's kind of go deeper, right? So this happens in 3 ways. The first way is with the source of the thought, the actual arrival of the thought. With an unwanted intrusive thought, let's use the example of like a relationship, right? Let's say you and your partner just argued and you guys are you are now thinking about, because of that argument, well, does this mean that because of something that my partner said, maybe she actually doesn't really uh respect me the way I thought she does? And again, this arrives as a very ego-syntonic sensation. Like this is part of your natural flow of thinking, and it arrives because of a real trigger in reality, right? That's an example of more of a general anxious concern because it's actually connected to reality in some way. It seems like the thought itself is a pointer to something that's actually happening with reality, and there's some kind of correspondence to where as reality is moving, the thought is kind of having some sort of correlation there. Versus with an unwanted intrusive thought, imagine with your partner, everything is fine, nothing is wrong, and you guys are on vacation and things are great. And all of a sudden, right when you don't want to have this kind of thought, the thought arrives, what if when she said she loves me, she's faking it? And again, this is kind of subjective, right? Because like sometimes it can kind of teeter between ego-syntonic versus ego-dystonic kind of experiences, but you kind of notice this deep disproportionality with reality. Like this is just it arrived almost like there was no reason for the thought to arrive at this point, and it arrives. Okay, so that's disjointed in terms of its source. Then it's also disjointed in terms of its concern, the concern behind the thought. So with normal anxiety, the concern is typically around real world consequences. So if you're thinking about, oh, me and my spouse, me and my husband might break up. Okay, you are going to be concerned about, for example, the implications of divorce, the impact on the kids, the finances, the family drama, the legal costs, the lawyers, all this kind of stuff, right? Your mind is going to go and start thinking about reality, real world, external consequences. With intrusive thoughts, the threat tends to be more toward your inner reality, my sense of self, morality, and identity. It isn't about the actual content of the relationship in reality. It's about your internal perception of the relationship within your mind. And the thought is threatening that established sense of identity and narrative around the relationship that you have in here. So instead of asking, what happens if my marriage ends? The thought attacks my sense of security. What if my love isn't real? And instead of having the real conversation about that love or going to therapy or actually trying to pragmatically solve for that, you end up fighting with your own mind. And this is another way you can tell the concern is not about reality, because the way that you respond to that concern is almost like you're doing these really weird things to reassure yourself rather than actually like engage with the real concern, which is if you're actually worried about your relationship, talk to your spouse about it, talk it out, see if there's a solution, a resolution you can come to. But that's not actually where your concern lies. Your concern lies in the threat to your sense of self. So oftentimes, like maybe what you'll do is like you'll pull up a photo of your spouse and just look at it and like remind yourself, like, no, I do love her. Look, she's so beautiful. I love her. He's so handsome. I love him. Right. Or for example, you will reassurance text, just send these texts like, hey, do you still love me? And again, remember, these are ego-dystonic. And I keep adding this in there because it's like with relationships, it's really complicated, which is why I also wanted to use this example, because oftentimes it's really hard to tell like what's ego-syntonic versus what's ego-dystonic. But keep in mind, subjectively within the mind of this person, they don't want to be thinking this. They don't actively feel like this aligns with their sense of self, identity, values, what they would typically be worried about. It feels like an imposition on their mind, right? And then at the same time, the concern seems to be disconnected from reality in the sense that you're concerned with the inner meaning of the thought. And so, anyways, you'll send like these reassurance texts, or you'll try to um, prove the thought wrong in some kind of way. You'll like journal it out and just constantly like write, like, no, I do love her for XYZ reasons. And we want to bring in what we said earlier over here, which is that with an ego-syntonic thought, typically a sign of that is that you're actually investing in the real concern behind the thought and the actual content and the actual conclusions of the thought. You're invested in those conclusions. And so there's kind of like a logical kind of thought process of pros and cons and back and forth. And it seems like a productive type of worry, right? There's something at the end of that it's leading towards. Versus with an unwanted intrusive thought, the worry typically doesn't really lead to anything real or productive, because you're not really actually concerned with resolving the thought and investigating its meaning and opening it up, but rather the thought is closed and you don't even want to open it up. You're just bothered by its mere presence, and you just want a black and white yes or no answer to the thought. Hence why there's this sense of urgency, which is why the person can't wait for their spouse to come home and have a conversation with them. Because from the outside perspective, you'd be thinking, bro, if you're actually concerned with whether your spouse loves you or not, like just give it a second. Like let the relationship play out, and then you'll be able to tell with more evidence and more time. But this person can't afford that time, because for them, this thought is threatening their sense of security in the relationship, and they need an answer right now. And that was what contributes to this phenomenon of like this kind of dichotomy of, no, I need a yes or no black and white answer, because you're trying to fight the thought in your mind. You're not actually using the thought as a signpost to actual things happening in reality and trying to engage with reality through that thought in your mind. That's not what's happening. And finally, the third feature of this is that the resolution is disjointed from reality. What do I mean by that? With anxious thoughts, reality and the thought move together. So as my marriage gets better, typically, generally speaking, again, we want to avoid absolutes, but the anxiety, generally speaking, tends to go down. Marriage gets worse, the anxiety goes up. Very interestingly, with an unwanted intrusive thought, there's no correlation. The marriage improves and the thought could still be there. I still am wondering whether or not my spouse loves me or not, because not because I'm actually thinking about it, but because it's arriving as an ego-dystonic sensation and I don't really know what to do about it. And very interestingly, and we'll explore why this happens later, it's possible, I'm not saying this always happens, but it's possible that even when the marriage is bad and you would think that the anxiety would be really high if it was a real, true anxiety, it's possible for the intrusive thought to actually go away. Even like, let's say you just had a bad conversation with your spouse last night and you have like a type of relationship OCD. It's possible like your OCD doesn't spike the night after a real argument. Like it's more just like you're genuinely having ego-syntonic concerns about like you're thinking about the actual content of the argument, but you're not actually doing the whole song and dance of like, I need some reassurance right now of whether or not my spouse loves me. You're not really engaging that type of ego-dystonic thought. For some reason, that thought kind of just went away. And you would think like, that's so weird. Why is it that like this is the time when a type of thought like that is supposed to arrive, because I just had an argument with my spouse. This is when the thought is supposed to happen, but it doesn't arrive then. Like that's so interesting. And we'll explore why that happens. But that's just like another thing that I've noticed from my reading and different people's forums on Reddit and stuff like that. And even from personal experience, like that tends to kind of happen with unwanted intrusive thoughts. So hopefully that all makes sense, right? It feels like reality is on a different track and the thought is on a different track with unwanted intrusive thoughts. Versus with general anxious thoughts, it feels like even though there's maybe some level of disproportionality there, because the nature of an anxious thought is that you kind of are exaggerating or seeing things that aren't there and you have a fear of the unknown, but there seems like there's some kind of correlation there. But with an unwanted intrusive thought, it seems oddly disconnected from reality, like disproportionately disconnected. So now let's get into the third way that unwanted intrusive thoughts differ from general anxiety type of thoughts. So unwanted intrusive thoughts are oddly specific. And as from the examples we gave, right, these were like very specific, bizarrely specific thoughts. And with a general anxiety thought, it's more of like a general anxious concern that you have, and it's hard to really pinpoint what the feeling is, what exactly it is that you're thinking about or worried about. It's kind of like this abstract shadow of fear of the unknown that kind of takes like some real work to really unpack and wrestle with, because again, the anxiety is correlated with like real fears and concerns out there in the world in reality, and so there's some kind of correlation there. And so some for example, right, like a more general anxiety could be something like, I'm worried and scared that something bad might happen to my child as a parent, right? More of an intrusive type of thought, an unwanted intrusive thought would be, what if my child gets shot today in a school shooting? Like, not generically you're thinking about it, but today in a school shooting, what if my child gets shot? Like, that's oddly specific. Like imagine going up to someone and being like, hey, so I'm really worried that like today there's a school shooter at our son's school. And it's like, wait, why? Like, what? Why do you think that? And it's like, I don't know. I just, I don't know. I need some reassurance that that's not going to happen today. And it's like, what? Like, what are you talking about? And this also contributes to like why it can feel so, like, embarrassing for the person who experiences unwanted intrusive thoughts to, like, talk to people about it because these are, like, real as you saw from the examples I read, right? It's like the minute you hear it, like, sometimes it's, like, almost laughable. Like, "What? Like, what do you mean you're thinking about this?" But for the person, like, it's not a joke. Like, they genuinely have this deep, distressing feeling that is threatening their sense of self, reality, identity, truth, morality. The thought seems too odd, too sharp-edged, too foreign to pass off as a normal worry. And it this is very profound because this is what this overspecificity is essentially what contributes to the obsession. Because if it was a generic concern, it's very hard to be obsessed over a generic concern. Like, how can I be obsessed over this generic shadow abstract of like, oh, you know, I one day might trip and fall and break my arm, right? But this idea that every time I get into my car, I'm going to get in a car accident. Like, that's very oddly specific, and that is something that because it's so specific, it actually is a thought that you can, like, pinpoint and talk back to, and because of its over specificity and the fact that you can talk back to it, that's what actually contributes to the fact that it's a really good candidate. This feature is a really good candidate for the thought becoming an obsession because of its over specific nature, because it's hard to become specific about this general hard to become obsessed about this general abstract concern. Like, it's possible, but it's just harder versus if you pinpoint something really specific that hits to your sense of self and threatens the sacred territory of your mind, it's like, oh god, we got to do something about this specific thought. Now, reason number 4, the fourth way that unwanted intrusive thoughts differ from more general anxious thoughts is that with unwanted intrusive thoughts, the concern is very, very high stakes. If the thought is true, it is very scary to even imagine that in my mind. And that's why with many of the examples we read before, right? Like, let's go back to them, right? Like, what if I shout something obscene at a funeral? This is not like a casual thing. Like, this has real serious implications over like my sense of control over my sense of self in a situation where I really want to be in control of myself. So it's like very scary to imagine like what if something like that happens? Like, oh god, you know? Um what if I'm secretly a bad person and or I'm secretly an immoral evil person who wants to harm children and I don't know about that. And I'm a parent. And I'm, like, hugging my child and also getting this thought at the same time that, "Oh, I might violate them." Like, bro, that's so bad, you know? Like, you'd be like, "What? Oh my god." Like, that's a huge high stakes concern. Like, I'm very much invested in figuring out whether or not that actually applies to me. So, with general type of anxiety, like, what would a not high stakes concern look like? Like, the thought could feel, like, pressing, urgent to a certain degree, but there's always like a room for like reflection, waiting, panning out. Let's gather some more evidence. I'm really anxious, but like let's see, I guess. Let's see. With an intrusion, it feels like an alarm bell is ringing in your mind and you need to know the answer right this second. You cannot wait. You need some reassurance right now. So you lock your door, you get in your car, you start driving. Oh my God, what if someone broke in? A robber's in my house right now and is literally might like be killing my children. Like very, very high stakes concern. And all of a sudden now you, even though you really do feel like, dude, I locked the door, but even the sliver of doubt, even a 1% chance that it's not right, your whole family is dead. Like that's a huge concern that you have. And so you decide to go back and check. So those are the 4 ways that unwanted intrusive thoughts differ from general anxiety thoughts. To recap, unwanted intrusive thoughts feel like an attack on your sense of self. You seem to be concerned with the thought's inner meaning more than the thought's correlation to reality itself. They tend to be bizarrely specific concerns, and they carry a deep sense of urgency to find an answer right now in the present moment because of the high stakes nature of the concern. Okay. Now that we kind of have discussed the difference between ego-syntonic and ego-dystonic thoughts, I want to give an appreciation of the difference between ego-syntonic and ego-dystonic in the context of why it's so valuable for you to study OCD even if you are ego-syntonic. If you have ego-syntonic concerns and you have a general anxiety that you don't really relate to this whole unwanted intrusive thing, but you are generally like an overthinker, compulsive thinker, etc., right? Why is it still valuable for you to study OCD literature? It's valuable because with an ego-syntonic concern, the actual underlying concern aligns with my sense of self. However, the thought that I'm getting, the anxiety that I have of what if I get laid off, right? The concern is the fear of getting laid off. The thought is taking advantage of my fear of getting laid off by taking this small little thing that happened with my manager at work and then catastrophizing it to be this huge scenario where, oh, but what if I get laid off? And then how am I going to pay for my this bill? And you just start, you know, unraveling and catastrophizing all of a sudden, right? But it's an ego-syntonic experience, so it's more of a general anxiety kind of concern. In a scenario like this, thinking about reframing your perspective, journaling, going to the gym, these things all help. But they're all ways to deal with the reality of the problem, which is good because, like we said, there is a correlation between the thought and reality. However, sometimes an ego-syntonic thought itself still needs to be dealt with in terms of understanding the mechanisms behind how the thought is starting to take control and power over your mind and starting to create this type of exaggerated type of worry, and how that anxiety is starting to manifest itself and you doing certain things that may be unproductive, like constantly arguing with the thought in your mind instead of sitting with that uncertainty. And if you're not able to do that, it may lead to these kinds of obsessive compulsive loops. Even though you don't have OCD because it's not an ego dystonic experience, it's kind of like an ego syntonic manifestation of an obsessive compulsive cycle. Because I get this thought, what if I get laid off? And then I kind of go through this like this kind of mental gymnastics of fighting my own mind. And then I kind of let go of it and I'm able to like easily kind of go in and out of these thoughts. Like it's not like it's really stuck or it's really extremely distressing the same way it might be for an OCD patient. However, it's still something I don't like. I don't want to be experiencing this constant thing within my sense of self, even though it's egosyntonic in the sense that I know I'm doing it and it aligns with my sense of self. It's still something that I'd like to change. And studying OCD literature gives you the power to do that change by deeply understanding the problem in the first place. Why is it that these thoughts tend to get catastrophized? What exactly is happening in that process of catastrophization? What are the mechanisms that lead to that? What are the mechanisms that lead to my anxiety? What are the mechanisms that lead from my anxiety to doing unproductive reassurance seeking activities with my own mind, or trying to ask people for reassurance, or rereading certain messages from my manager that I don't really need to be rereading because this wasn't even that big of a scenario to begin with? All of these kinds of things, studying OCD literature gives you an appreciation of what's really happening there, even if you don't have an ego dystonic concern. Okay, cool. So now we've discussed what an unwanted intrusive thought is, how it differs from a general anxiety concern. And if we remember the initial thesis from this video, we said that an unwanted intrusive thought is something everyone generically kind of does experience at one point or another. You've maybe experienced a thought like this, even if you don't have OCD. However, when with people with an OCD sensitive mind, these types of thoughts tend to get stuck, increase in intensity, increase in frequency, and certain mechanisms happen in the mind of the person that ends up leading to eventually full blown obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay. Now, that how this process happens, I will cover in future videos. The why it happens to a certain person rather than other people. Why do some people have OCD sensitive minds? What are the factors that lead to an OCD sensitive mind? I'll cover that in just a second. What I want to cover right now is the what, right? So the how of OCD, the why of OCD, the what. The why we'll cover in a second. The how we'll cover in the next video. The what I want to cover right now. What exactly does this look like? Because we gave examples before of what unwanted intrusive thoughts look like, but now what does it look like when it's come full circle and it's now an obsessive? It's the unwanted intrusive thought has now developed into an obsession, and to alleviate the anxiety from that obsession, this person is doing now compulsions. What does that actually look like? Okay, so the first thing is there's let's give some examples, right? So the first example is, let's say there's a scenario of like at work, right? A general anxiety concern, like I just said, is what if, based on my manager's bad feedback, I might get laid off? Okay, ego-syntonic concern, I identify with it, I'm catastrophizing, we got that. Tied to real world outcomes. An unwanted intrusive thought would be something like, let's say my manager is the only one who is watching me perform really well at work, and I have a promotion cycle coming up, and I'm really excited for that cycle. All of a sudden, I get an unwanted intrusive thought. What if my manager dies before my promotion? And if you think about it, this checks a lot of the boxes of the features of an unwanted intrusive thought. I'm not going to recover them, but this thought is incredibly distressing for the person. Certain things happen with the way they're engaging with the thought, which we'll discuss later, but let's just grant me that it becomes an obsession now because of this person's OCD sensitive mind. It becomes an obsession. Now they've developed certain compulsions to alleviate the anxiety of that thought of what if my manager dies. And again, the compulsions look really oddly not helpful to determining what to actually saving their manager if they are actually concerned with their manager's health. But that's the whole point. So they might do some reassurance stuff, like, for example, they'll monitor their manager status throughout the day, or on Mondays, they'll log in and they'll double check. Okay, is my manager still there? Okay, my manager's alive. Okay, I can relax. They'll scan, Slack messages, email messages to kind of make sure that they're still kind of hearing from their manager. Maybe they'll do this thing where, like, at the end of a message, they'll write like, "I hope that you feel you are in good health this weekend," right? Um, or they start doing these prayers to like ask God to give your manager a long life because you're scared that you're secretly wishing for their death. Right. So these are just some examples, right? Or there's some avoidance rituals that you develop, right? So, like, certain things I'll avoid doing with my manager. So, for example, I'll avoid um, taking them out to eat because I'm worried that if I take them out to eat and I spend too much time with them, what if they pass away the next day and then I feel guilty about the fact that maybe it was something I did. I took them to a restaurant and I got them food poisoning, and that's the reason they passed away. No, no, no. I don't want to contribute to that. I don't want to be the reason for my manager's death because of this obsession they have over what if my manager passes away before my promotion. And it just feels incredibly distressing for the person. It feels disconnected from reality. They're developing all these types of reassurance seeking activities to alleviate this concern, which itself feels so stupid. And the person knows it feels so stupid, but they can't help and stop themselves from doing these really silly things to stop a really silly, unlikely thought. Okay, that's one example. Another example, harm OCD. Okay, let's say a general anxious concern is, what if with your children, right? You're a parent, the scenarios with your children. What if I didn't child proof my house well enough and my child gets hurt? Okay, that's a logical extension of a real safety concern, general anxiety. Now, an unwanted intrusive thought would be something more like, what if I throw my child down the stairs and you're like walking with your baby one day and you just get this thought? What if I throw my child down the stairs? Okay, horrifying, ego-dystonic, but eventually it sticks and it becomes an obsession. Okay, now you start to do certain things with you start to do certain reassurance seeking activities to regain an illusion of control. So you're mentally reviewing your intentions. Every time I pick up the child, I'm repeating to myself, I do not intend this child any harm. You seek reassurance from other people. Hey, like, you haven't noticed anything in me, right? Like, I'm not like violent or becoming more aggressive lately, like, right? Like, I'm good. Maybe again, certain avoidance rituals. You avoid certain going down the stairs with your child. Every time you get to the stairs, you hand off your child to your spouse or to another son or daughter that you have, and you hand off the child to them because you tell them, look, you hold the child. I don't want to deal with it. Generally speaking, maybe you in event again, it often comes in the form of like really weird rituals that you do, and again, this is a sign that it's a compulsion because it's creating this false illusion and sense of control when there really is none. So you might do this thing where it's like, I can only hold the baby for 15 minutes at a time. Something bad is going to happen at the 16th minute. Like again, it's very arbitrary, and it's possible actually to show the arbitrariness of the compulsion. It's possible that it evolves over time. So it's like it's 15 minutes this time, but it's 25 minutes the next time. It's like, wait, how did we jump from 15 to 25? But like the person is not actually concerned with like a real systematic way of how to solve this problem. It's more just out of that sense of urgency, they're kind of just following whatever their mind signals are throwing at them to kind of try to alleviate that anxiety and fight back the thought in their own mind. Okay, next example. Religious OCD, scrupulosity, right? General anxious concern. I'll use a more Islamic version because I'm Muslim and I can relate to that. So like I'm worried that I'm not praying correctly. What if Allah doesn't accept my prayer? Okay. That worry is tied to real religious performance and outcome. Let's say it's an ego-syntonic experience. Let's say it's corresponding to reality in the sense that, like, I read a book on prayer, how to focus better in my prayer. The next prayer, I'm more intentional with it. Okay, general anxious concern, it should kind of go down. But with an obsession or with an unwanted intrusive thought, I'm in the middle of my prayer, things are going good, things are fine. I get this random thought, what if I skipped something? What if I didn't pray perfectly? What if I didn't recite that word perfectly enough? And a sign that it's not legit is you repeat it and the worry doesn't go away, and you repeat it again and again and it's not going away, and you're saying everything perfectly but it's not going away. It seems like it's not corresponding with reality in any way. Or another example is you're doing your wudu, right? And let's say you missed a spot on your elbow genuinely one time, and you're just like kind of worried about it because like you genuinely were like, I really rushed that will do. The next will do, you do better. Okay, you feel better. General anxious concern. Unwanted intrusive thought, you're doing your will do and everything is fine. All of a sudden, you're getting to a certain spot on your elbow and you did it right. You did it as you always do it. But then you get this thought, what if I missed a spot? And what if my will do doesn't count? High stakes situation. Okay, now I need to repeat my will do. So I need to redo it again. You do it again, it doesn't really alleviate the thought. There's still that sliver of doubt there. It's a very high stakes situation. You need absolute certainty. And then you decide to do it again and again and again. And now you're stuck in this obsessive compulsive cycle. Okay, relationship OCD. And we kind of covered this, but we're going to recover it just to make it really clear, right? General anxiety, me and my spouse are arguing a lot. What if we're actually not compatible with each other? Okay. An unwanted intrusive thought, everything is going fine, things are good, we're happy. I keep getting these thoughts, what if my spouse is secretly in love with someone else? And again, the nature of it is it's very it's very it's a very high stakes doubt, and it doesn't respond well to an investigation. It's a yes or no, a really weird yes or no. So it's either my spouse loves me or doesn't. There's no nuance there. There's no opening up of the thought. There's just very much, I am threatened by the mere presence of this thought, and I need some reassurance right now. And so you do certain compulsions. It becomes an obsession. You become obsessed with this idea of my spouse is in love with someone else or not in love with me. And you do all these compulsions. You repeatedly ask questions. You do these texts. You keep checking your feelings. You keep looking at photos of them. And again, apply the same logic, right? Certain avoidance rituals, certain rituals to manifest something. Okay. So now I think we've got a flavor of what OCD actually looks like. Now I want to give you the why, right? So that was the what, the why. Like what leads to someone having an OCD sensitive mind and other people not having an OCD sensitive mind, such that when they get ego-dystonic, unwanted intrusive thoughts, those thoughts are able to pass versus other people with full on OCD, those thoughts are not able to pass as easily. So OCD is a biopsychosocial disorder. There's biology in the sense that there are genetic components. I'm not going to pretend to really know what they are or how it works, to be honest. Like something in your brain chemistry, your makeup. I'll put a video in the description by Dr. K. He does a really good job of actually explaining like some of the logic behind that. The way that I understand it is like you have a very overactive, sticky mind in the sense that um, thoughts tend to take longer to pass through your psyche and your mind. Okay. Um, and because of that, um, you can imagine certain thoughts that are very threatening to your sense of self and security. Those thoughts are going to be stuck even more than others already because they're so threatening in their nature. But then they're threatening in their nature and they're not passing easily, which creates this concoction of like a really, really hard thought to deal with. And it's not even correlated to reality. So it's like so deceptive, you know? Okay, so that's genetic. So now let's go on to the next thing, which is psychological, biopsycho, right? Psychological states of mind. So there are certain states of mind, and these are like learned patterns of thought that you've developed, partly because of nature, perhaps, partly because of nurture. But what they look like are, for example, one, there's malignant shame. We covered this concept in the last episode, like a lot of internalized shame, blame. It's not guilt where I'm guilty for a specific action that I've done, but it's shame in the sense of my sense of being. I'm shame. I feel bad for even existing. I feel bad for my sense of self. I feel bad about things that I care about. There's a sense of shame there. Okay. There's a deep desire for control and certainty. You need a lot of certainty naturally. Um, you really struggle with the idea of losing control. There's a negative attribution bias in the sense that you tend to catastrophize. You tend to take a small data point and build the worst case scenario out of it. And then finally, there's the social factors, for example, like trauma. So let's say like you had trauma before related to a spouse cheating on you. And now you've developed an ego-dystonic version of that where you're constantly worried about whether your spouse is now going to cheat on you. And let's say, for example, there's a fear of contamination that you have because in your past you actually have had exposure to contamination, or this trauma could not have been done to you, but let's say like you watched the show Chernobyl, and now all of a sudden that triggers these fears of contamination, and that thought that you have about contamination interacts with this already existing like PTSD or trauma that you have within you. Another kind of social factor, so to speak, is um, the anxiety that is caused by like the environment around you. Let's say you're just in a really stressful situation in life right now, and that leads to a kind of fight or flight response in your mind or a fight or flight state of being in your mind. And this thought makes that fight or flight state of being much worse. And there are specific features of the fight or flight state of mind that we'll cover in future episodes that kind of lead to this thought getting stuck in the first place. But anyways, that's a side point. But yeah, there's social factors as well. And so OCD is bio, psychosocial. All three of these factors together create the conditions for a very highly flammable environment, such that these types of thoughts, when they enter into your mind, they tend to really stick. And your mind is a very good candidate for attracting these types of thoughts and having these types of thoughts be very high in intensity and frequency, which yields to them becoming obsessions, which then yields to them becoming compulsions. And I think specifically with the idea of like your ability to resist the compulsion aspect, I think there's also some genetic things at play there too. In the Dr. K video, he kind of explains it. Overall, this kind of begs the question of, is it possible to get better? You know, what does healing and recovery even look like? In my understanding, there's a concept in neuroscience, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm sorry if I'm butchering this, but it's called neuroplasticity. And it's this idea that neurons that fire together wire together. And it's basically this idea that, and I'll just kind of read it, although your brain has learned to associate the obsession with fear and to automatically trigger the fight or flight alarm, you can retrain your brain to instead form new neural pathways and connections to respond with acceptance rather than fear. But like with any learned skill, it takes intentional practice and repetition to break instinctive habits and form new ones. Now, here's the kicker. This isn't a promise that your obsessions will disappear forever, but instead that you learn to coexist with them to such an extent that their presence no longer matters. And that's really the goal of healing, because there's always going to be that genetic component. There's always going to be, everyone experiences wanting intrusive thoughts, but for some reason in my mind, these thoughts tend to stick a lot longer. My thought tends to attract these types of thoughts. However, I can reverse the learned patterns that my mind has developed in terms of how it interacts and engages with those thoughts, such that I may experience the thought. However, my thought does not necessarily gravitate towards then becoming a full on obsession and compulsion, because I've learned how to deal with those tiny match flames and how to kind of extinguish that inferno to where it no longer is, my mind is no longer that flammable. It may still be a bit more flammable than other people's minds, but not to such a degree to where it automatically goes to full blown obsessive compulsive disorder, to where I'm literally doing compulsions for a majority of my day. This may sound kind of bleak, right? Because it's like, well, this means that like I'll always kind of have a sticky mind. I'll always have this sensitivity to these types of unwanted intrusive thoughts. And I just want to say that while that's true, this is me kind of getting out of this research based kind of thing and more into kind of a subjective experiential uh, explanation of something that I think could help for people that are in the process of recovering from OCD and are trying to really reframe this experience to try to make it more positive for them and put a positive spin on it and to kind of see the silver lining. This is my best attempt to try to do that. And this genuinely is aligned with my own personal experience. This may not be the case for you, and that's okay. But like, I'm just going to go and say, like, for me, this is kind of how I try to view it. So the way that I see it is that when you start to recover and you start to develop the capacity to better deal with certain unwanted intrusive thoughts that you're having, and that, let's say, like, your OCD manifests itself in a certain theme and you've overcome that theme in the sense that like it no longer, you may get these thoughts every now and then because of certain triggers, but like it no longer is something you're constantly obsessed about, or you have these constant compulsions about. Um, in the process of recovery, you develop a series of skill sets. I would like to call it a mental literacy. You develop a mental literacy. You develop a a practiced ability to observe thoughts without reacting. You develop the ability to detect this false sense of urgency, this false high stakes concern. You develop the ability to sit with uncertainty. Um, you develop an ability to disassociate from the thoughts that you're having in your mind. And I think because you're experiencing ego-dystonic thoughts, which by their nature are against your sense of self and values and are and therefore experienced as very subjectively distressing, and therefore require like a constant examination and awareness of what's happening in your mind to really fight this thing. Like, you cannot just passively be mindless. You have to like, the process of recovery requires like really developing skill sets of deep awareness of what's happening in your psyche. That skill set, I'd argue, once you start to imagine, there's like an ego-dystonic sliding scale and an ego-syntonic sliding scale. The ego-syntonic sliding scale is like a more generalized type of anxiety over here, and then as it gets more extreme, you like have like rumination and compulsive thinking, right? But again, it's all thoughts that you kind of align with. Versus an ego-dystonic type of thing is like unwanted intrusive thoughts, and then all the way over here is like full-blown OCD. Now you're over here on this ego-dystonic sliding scale. And as your ego-dystonic sliding scale comes back the other way and starts to just manifest itself as unwanted intrusive thoughts that you experience just like everyone else, but eventually they pass. as your process of recovery leads to this, I'd argue that your capacity to then deal with ego-syntonic type of concerns, like just general concerns about the fear of the unknown and the fear of life and general anxiety, your capacity to deal with that is like 10x. Because now I know and I understand how my own mind works. I understand how to deal with uncertainty, how to sit with that doubt, how to not engage in excessive reassurance seeking activity. And it's really hard when when I don't identify with the thought, because there's a natural sense of guilt and shame associated with that. You know, like I might harm my own child. That's really hard to sit with. But general anxious thoughts that you actually identify with, because you've developed the capacity to sit with those extreme thoughts that literally deny your entire sense of self, your ability to sit with thoughts that are actually very much aligned with your sense of self increases naturally by a lot because of those underlying skills that you've developed. And so now you're able to kind of swim through the thoughts of your mind, versus before you were like drowning. You were like drowning because of these ego-dystonic thoughts. But now that you've moved that sliding scale down, you can also then move the other sliding scale way far on the other side to where you barely experience that much generalized anxiety, or you do, but your capacity to deal with it is so strong. And so the best metaphor that I can give is there's a possibility that in your process of healing, you develop these skill sets that allow you to swim through all types of thoughts in your mind, ego-dystonic thoughts and ego-syntonic thoughts. And not only are you swimming, but eventually you know, start surfing. You build yourself a jet ski, then a speedboat, then you got a whole freaking yacht, and you're swimming through, the waves of your mind, and you are doing good. And every now and then, because you still have a propensity to have more ego dystonic thoughts than the average person, or attract those types of thoughts, you may experience a situation where, let's say, your particular theme of OCD shows up again. And let's say, in the sake of this metaphor, like there's like this false storm, this stormy weather that is like a false illusion. It's not really stormy, but it feels stormy. And occasionally you encounter those things, or you occasionally encounter a shark in the water, right? And it's not really like dangerous, but you're perceiving it as dangerous. And you have to learn how to manage and deal with that perception, right? You're learning these skill sets. And so every now and then you will encounter certain things that challenge that skill set that you're developing. And that's just a normal part of your experience of the water of your mind. But at the very least, you know when the storm is false. You know when the shark is false. And once those experiences pass, you're able to push through them, which you'll develop the skill sets to do that, to push through these ego dystonic type of experiences. Then it's just ego-syntonic, regular, generic worries, and you're able to, again, start swimming, start being on your yacht, surfing, whatever, in your mind. And I hope that this analogy makes sense. Like, this is the way that I personally view it, because I subjectively have experienced that. Like, me engaging myself deeply in this literature has helped me deal with generic concerns. And every now and then, the specific OCD theme will pop up, and you've learned how to deal with it, you learn how to do it, and the unwanted intrusive thought then dies down, and you move on with your life, and you don't engage in any more compulsions. It's just that subjectively you do experience a little bit of distress from that thought, and then you have to go back to the learned skills that you developed through all of your practice, which we'll get into, right? So hopefully that helps. Okay. I really don't think this is a cope. But this is my personal subjective experience. Maybe someone's like, bruh, that's not me. Like, this thing is hell for me. It's been hell. It always has been hell. I don't relate to anything you're saying. That's fine. This is not like clinical research I'm giving you. I'm just giving you my subjective experience of this. Okay. Now, finally, I want to give this a religious kind of angle as well, for those that are suffering from a type of religious OCD. If you have a faith-based worldview and you suffer from a type of religious OCD, one way that you can console yourself, and this is what I said in the last video, but maybe I didn't make it clear enough. Now that we've brought it full circle, I can kind of bring it full circle here too, is that again, like we just said, your capacity to deal with the thoughts of your mind is increased, which means you can spend more time in reality, engaged in the present world, and not stuck in this constant rumination in your mind. And God exists here in reality. And for some people, it's possible they've never developed the underlying skill sets to actually engage and stay present in reality. They're constantly identifying with the noise in their mind. Even though even if it's ego-syntonic noise, they just haven't developed that underlying skill set to disidentify from that. And so they're just constantly stuck in this mental noise and anxiety and worry and uncertainty and desires of the future and attachments of the world. And I really do believe that through your process of healing, you kind of learn to just value your mental peace. And as you start to develop more value for your mental peace, you just start to enjoy just living in the present moment. Like, I don't want to be constantly ruminating about these things. And, you may build on your underlying skill sets from engaging with OCD literature and that process of healing to then learn more about, just general things that can help with general anxiety, like having a structure and a routine and journaling and meditation and all of these different practices. And you have that underlying awareness and skill sets that you've built through your OCD healing. And so now you spend a lot of time just appreciating the present moment. And I think that that allows you to then deeply appreciate your relationship with God better because God exists here in this present moment. God does not exist in your mental rumination and noise in your mind. God is experienced in the here and now. And I think if you can really deeply appreciate that, and I know this is a bit esoteric, if you're not really spiritual or religious, like, you can disregard what I'm saying. But for those who are, I think you'll understand what I'm trying to say. You have developed the requisite skills to meaningfully engage with the present moment and can now have and step into a deeper relationship with the divine. And that was all born out of this kind of initial almost poison of your mind, parasite of your mind. But it's allowed you to now be a master of your own mind, or at least someone who's who has deep knowledge of your own mind and can now swim through it. And I think that that is valuable. And that's for me something that I've taken away as a subjective kind of reframing of, you know, why OCD? Because you really, once you start to heal, you have to answer that question. Why? Why this? You know? Um, and different people can answer in different ways. Another way is like I learned it so I can help other people. Like that's also for me one of the reasons, right? But there's also other reasons, and I think this is like one of them as well. Um, so yeah, that's everything I wanted to say. I really hope that this video is beneficial to you. Please, if you watch till this point, let me know in the comments. Let your boy know that there's people out there engaging with these videos, watching them. It's not going to change whether or not I continue with this series. Like, inshallah, I will continue. But like, I just want to know that, hey, there's people out there. They're engaging. They're watching. Like, there's actual benefit that this is producing in the real world. I think that will just kind of motivate me even further, to keep going. And yeah, let me know what you think. Give me feedback, give me thoughts, concerns, suggestions, etc. I'd love to hear from all of you. And yeah, we'll just keep chugging through this series. I really hope you appreciate the level of depth that we went into. And yeah, till next time, assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon you all.